So we are now going to excuse Dr. Coleman and Dr. Hamilton. Thank you so much again for your participation.
You're welcome.
Thank you, and we'll say goodbye to you now. And now we are going to have a one-on-one interview with the author of the book, Dr. Dickerson. We're going to be taking audience questions as well as some pre-generated questions so we can delve even more deeply into the book. So again, if you are watching and you would like to submit a question, you may do so now, and we will try to cover as much as we can. So the first question is, an AME church service culminates with the preached word. That's a central element of Methodism, and of course, African Methodism. So please talk about the importance of the sermon in the AME order of service and give us some insight into some of the great preachers you heard while you were growing up.
The centrality of the sermon in AME worship is a mark of the AME Church as a Protestant religious body. In the Anglo-Catholic tradition, it's the sacrament, it's the Eucharist, that's the center of the service. After the Reformation, churches, Protestant churches in the Reformed and in the Methodist tradition made the preached word the central part of the worship. And whenever the sermon is decentered, it becomes an un-AME service. Whenever other parts of the service overwhelm or sideline or marginalize the sermon, that's un-AME. The preached word is the central feature, the indispensable core of the worship. The second part of the question, who were some of the great preachers you heard growing up? I had a chance to hear one preacher in particular, Dr. Augustus Cicero Sumter, who was pastor of St. James AME Church in Pittsburgh. And I remember as an adolescent going to the Pittsburgh Annual Conference with my mother and grandmother and hearing Dr. Sumter preach. I thought it was the voice of God. He had a strong, booming voice. And I'll never forget him preaching about God as the sustainer. And I mean, I can hear that sermon right now. He was pastor of the largest church in the Pittsburgh Conference. When I went to Lincoln University in Pennsylvania, we had chapel. We had Vesper services every Sunday. And one of the best friends of our chaplain was an AME preacher from Philadelphia, who was a Lincoln graduated from the college and seminary at Lincoln University, the Reverend Dr. William P. Stevenson. And Dr. Stevenson, that man could, it's almost like his voice was poetic. He preached with such clarity and precision and and a depth of spirituality that I'm still awed by the memory of Dr. Stevenson. And then lastly, there are many
Of course.
heard. Another was my bishop growing up, Bishop Eugene Clifford Hatcher. That man could really preach, and all of his sermons ended with him singing, "The storm is passing over." And
Wow.
Another person, when I lived in Philadelphia with my parents, after we had moved from Western Pennsylvania to Philadelphia, our presiding elder, Dr. Charles E. Stewart, who was both seminary trained and he also had a law degree, very tall man. He must have been around 6'4". And that man, in speaking hardly above a whisper, was eloquent and arresting and compelling. There were a variety of preaching styles that I heard, but AMEs traditionally had the reputation of being the best trained preachers among the African American denominations. And I saw evidence of that in some of those that I've just mentioned and a few others whom I have not mentioned. So we have a tradition of great preaching.
Well, absolutely. And I've heard some great sermons myself when I was little, and I'm still hearing some great sermons today. So we have another audience question, this one from Diane Long. Hello, Diane. Thank you for joining us and thank you for your question. She said that she is researching moaning songs, which enslaved people sang in the field during church and as church devotions. And where can she find more information about, I guess, the traditions of music among enslaved people?
There are a number of volumes on that, but I would point you to an early volume by Mark Miles Fisher about the Negro spirituals that goes into some depth about the historicity of the spirituals and some analysis of their musical styles. But that's only one of many books. If you just simply Google, you can find many of them.
Okay. So another question that we have is thinking of the book as a whole. So we've talked about it chapter by chapter and really taken it piece by piece, but looking at the book as a whole, is there something that you wish you could have added, but you didn't for the sake of time or for the sake of, something else? And if so, what would you like to have added, but you were not able to for whatever reason?
Since we're in this current and sad COVID crisis, I wished I had devoted a section of the book to the church's response to the 1918 influenza epidemic that claimed in the United States some 675,000 lives. The church had a response to that, and many of our annual conferences were suspended. Some of the annual conferences got permission from various state governments to have abbreviated sessions, but there was a fulsome church response to that. And in light of this current event, I wished I had had the foresight to include in the volume. That's just an example of how other questions arise after you publish a book that you wish you had noted and inserted in the volume.
Well, sort of, I guess the converse question of that is about things that you did include. Obviously, the book is already 600 some pages,
yeah.
And as you were going through the process of figuring out what to have, what to keep, what to take out, is there anything that you considered taking out, but that you're glad you kept in?
Yes, there was a section. One of the things I wanted, because I had in mind that the AME Church throughout its history has thought of itself as an Atlantic world institution, as a global church. I wanted to make sure as much as possible that persons throughout the breadth of African Methodism could read the book and find themselves in the book itself, that anybody from the many countries in Africa and the Caribbean, in Canada, throughout the United States, that they could find something in the book that spoke to their particular AME experience. And I remember in one of the chapters, I went on at some length about a Bermuda minister who was involved in the Garvey movement, R.H. Tobit. And it's a fairly long section. And I thought about, and I was advised by some to cut that because I had gone on a little bit too long. But it said a lot about the history of the church in Bermuda. And I thought about it, and I subsequently decided to leave it just as it was. And in retrospect, now I'm glad I did it.
I'm glad you did too, because I know part of your thought process in figuring out what to keep and what to perhaps cut was, if I don't write about this, is anyone else going to in the foreseeable future? And the Tobit story, which was so fascinating, in which when we discussed it in a previous panel, it elicited a considerable response. That is something that, had you not published it, I don't know, who else would have anytime soon. So I'm really glad that you kept that piece in. Something else that I know is very important to you about this book and about the legacy of this book is the impact that it's going to have on future scholars like myself, like Christina Davidson and many others. So what are some elements of the book that you hope will inspire future study?
Well, throughout the book, the book is divided up into sections. That wasn't my idea. Actually, that was the mandate of the publisher. He told me to go back through the manuscript and segment the chapters by sections. And any one of those sections could be a study all of its own. And I'm hoping that those persons reading the book, particularly those persons who are scholars who are looking for subjects to write, that they can take some of the foundational narratives that are presented in the book and delve deeper into it. There's a section about AMEs who are involved in the westward migration into Kansas and into Nebraska. That can be a separate study all of its own. Your own work about African Methodism and American Indians is going to be published next year. Christina Davidson, who has done a dissertation and turned it into a book about African Methodism in the Dominican Republic. There are any number of African Methodism and pandemics. There was the yellow fever epidemic in Philadelphia in the 1790s. There were yellow fever epidemics throughout the 19th century. There was a Spanish influenza pandemic in the 20th century. Much can be done about African Methodism and health crises, epidemics. There are any number of subjects. I talked a great deal about the AME chaplaincy, both in World War I and in World War II. Fascinating experiences that deserve a book-length study. So I'm hoping that this book will spearhead any number of additional studies on particular topics.
Okay. And I believe we have another audience comment. Okay, so here's our comment. So I was listening to another AME webinar recently where the idea of our attitude in Africa being considered colonial. Never thought of that before then, but it's undoubtedly real. So I guess the question I would ask is, has the AME Church's efforts in Africa, can they be deemed as colonialist?
It's both. The attitude about Africa, the attitude about the Caribbean, in the context of the long sweep of AME history has been, we are coming to be the protectors and the saviors and brothers and sisters of our African and Caribbean brethren. So it was a familial attitude that we're reclaiming, and we're reconnecting with our brothers and sisters. As we operationalize that in terms of AME institutional behavior, we had attitudes and policies that in many cases were correctly perceived as colonial. To the extent that the church has behaved in a colonial fashion, that's not something that's embedded, that's in the DNA of our history. Those are things that we've developed in terms of institutional operation. And so there's been a separation in terms of what the intent and the initiative was originally and how it's developed in terms of institutional operation. And you have to be, and the church has to revisit how that transfer, how that transition happened and correct that, because this was not envisaged as a colonial church.
Certainly not.
It can be called that in terms of particular policies.
Okay. All right. How do you think Richard Allen would alter his vision if he were here now? Do you think he would still be pleased? Thank you for that question.
I think Richard Allen envisages his ministry as putting his community and his people first. He was not afraid of risk. He was not afraid of putting service to the people before the health of the institution. He saw the institution as a vehicle to advance African Americans in what became the United States, in the Caribbean, and in Africa. That was his priority. And I think that he would admonish us to recapture that vision of putting community needs before we think of institutional needs. And he
Can you
would
give an
argue
example of
that
that? Oh, sorry.
he would argue that if you take care of the people first, they'll take care of the institution.
Okay. Okay, makes perfect sense to me. All right, and we have another audience question. Oh, one of our longtime viewers. Thank you so much, Marilyn Acklin. Dr. Dickerson, thank you again for writing such a necessary contribution to world and American history. Would you share what you think are the greatest challenges facing the AME Church and how you think we can address them?
I think that the greatest challenge, there are two or three very important challenges. I think existential challenges. We have to make sure that the AME Church embraces Black youth. However imperfect, however unsophisticated, the AME Church ought to be inextricably identified with Black Lives Matter and any other movement that is aimed at enhancing for the public our concern about Black humanity. We have to be in the forefront. In 1942, a group of students at the University of Chicago formed a nascent civil rights organization. It became the Congress of Racial Equality.
Right.
And they had no place to be. They had no place for a headquarters. The Reverend Archibald J. Carey Jr. said to these young people, come to Woodlawn AME Church and set up your headquarters here. And you can use our mimeograph machine. Many people wouldn't remember mimeograph machines. That was the first headquarters of the Congress of Racial Equality. It became one of the significant Black civil rights organizations in the 1950s and 1960s. Some of the headquarters for Black Lives Matter ought to be in the AME Church. We ought to be identified with any movement that is all about the liberation of Black people. Yes, young people can sometimes be unsophisticated, sometimes they can be unlearned and so forth. It's the job of institutions like African Methodism to give them instruction, correction, but more importantly, support, to know that we have their back. And if we are identified with this current generation of young people, understanding what their aspirations are, and the AME Church does not have to worry about its survival.
I think, amen. Thank you, Ralph Johnson, for that comment. I agree that that's part of why I found so much of this book so riveting and so really eye-opening for me, because obviously I knew the main aspects of AME Church history. I know a lot about certain periods, but I was not as well versed in the 20th century history. And so I learned a great deal from the book about that and about how significant the church was in the civil rights movement, in everything that was related to assisting African Americans in this country. And I think you're absolutely right that the church should be certainly in support of these current movements like the Black Lives Matter movement. So next question. In your research for the book, was there anything that surprised you? So firstly, can you talk just briefly about how you researched this book? And because I know some people aren't as familiar with the kinds of materials that are available for AME history research. So talk a bit about that, and then say if there's anything that you came across in your research that surprised you.
Thank you for that question. The one thing to know about AMEs historically is that at the very genesis of the church, AMEs had a sense that what they were doing was important. The church elected its first historiographer in 1848. At that early date, they had a sense that what they were developing was important and was worth remembering. So the AME Church has a long record of writing things down, not only annual conference minutes, but also our clergy and our lay were very vigorous in writing autobiographies and making sure that they left behind important church records. I've spent a lifetime collecting these kinds of materials, and they are the basis of the book. And I hope that we never abandon the tradition of keeping keeping and collecting and storing important church records.
And actually, in that vein, can you talk specifically about annual conference minutes? Because I think a lot of times we automatically think AME records, that means general conference minutes. Can you talk a bit more about what particularly you can find in annual conference minutes from, the 1800s, the early 1900s, et cetera?
I remember as a child growing up in Payne Chapel AME Church in Duquesne, Pennsylvania, our pastor would come back from annual conference, and he would have the disciplines, and he would have a box full of annual conference minutes for people to buy, sometimes for $2, sometimes for $3. And my grandmother and my aunt, my parent, they had these annual conference minutes and these disciplines in the house. They were there next to our newspapers, our magazines, and so forth. And that was a routine part of our life as AMEs. These minutes from the 19th into the 20th century have valuable information. At the time that we had dollar money,
Right.
persons who paid their dollar money, their names would be listed in the annual conference minutes, the church, and it would list all the people who paid dollar money. Those persons doing genealogical research can look at those dollar money lists and correlate them with census records to find their ancestors. You would find in those annual conference minutes the speakers who would come. Oftentimes, you could do a political history of white governors and senators and mayors who came to the Kansas conference or to the Nebraska conference or to the North Georgia annual conference. These records are absolutely indispensable in doing AME history. They're indispensable in doing African American history.
Absolutely. I know from my own research, so much of what I got was from these annual conference minutes, those dollar money lists that give you the list of pretty much everyone who was, a member of that church. Those are invaluable for doing that type of research. So what could our AME seminaries, colleges, boards of examiners, and Christian education departments do to better educate our members about AME history or about anything else?
Let me just start with the seminaries. I think it's many of our seminaries are give courses in AME history and AME polity. Let me challenge us to think about the importance of a curriculum of AME studies. One can spend a semester just on AME theology, and there is an AME theology. One can spend a semester on AME polity, AME hymnody, AME history. All of these are separate subjects that have an integrity, an intellectual and doctrinal integrity of their own. And sometimes we just commingle them and blend them and not tease out what's theological, what's doctrinal, what's historical, what's hymnological, etc. And I think we ought to have a whole curriculum on AME studies, not only in our seminary, but in our boards of examiners. We ought to be, each annual conference used to have what was called a book steward. This was someone who went around not only the annual conferences, but to the various churches to make sure that churches were aware of the important books that ministers and lay people needed to have. Books about the AME Church, AME history, AME doctrine and discipline, but also other books that were important for AMEs to understand who they were and how their church should operate. In other words, we have to be more systematic and intentional about how we educate ourselves. Our Christian education department does a marvelous job of making that kind of literature available to our membership. But each of our departments needs foot soldiers in the annual conferences and in the local church to make sure that this literature, that these materials are disseminated.
And keeping with that theme, what kinds of books, specific books, with the exclusion of yours, of course, would you recommend for further study on AME history, theology, or liturgy?
For example, as I mentioned earlier in answer to another question, that when I pastored Payne AME Church in Chatham, New York, it was their tradition. I didn't start it. This has been in their tradition for generations. Every member had his or her own hymnal. And in our hymnal had a hymnology, a history of hymnody among in African Methodism. Everybody had that. When I was growing up, every member was expected to have his or her own personal copy of the discipline, to say nothing about having subscriptions to the Christian Recorder and the AME Church Review and the Missionary Magazine and the Voice of Missions. All of these items used to be a routine part or a routine feature of AME membership. That's less the case now. We don't publish annual conference minutes. We put things online now, and that's good. It makes it a lot easier. It's a lot cheaper. But whatever the medium, these sorts of things need to be made readily available, and they need to be an important part of ministerial training as well as membership training.
Okay, that makes perfect sense to me. So, thank you, Diane Sumter. Never heard of a book steward before. Thank you so much for that comment. So, what are you most proud of about this book? This has been really a lifetime project. You've been writing this book your whole life, even if you didn't know it. So, what are you most proud of about this book and about what you've accomplished?
Well, it's coming to two things. One, coming to the realization that persons outside of the AME Church sometimes have a greater appreciation for the institution than we ourselves have. Let me illustrate my point. I was approached by Cambridge University Press to do the book. It's something I've been working on all my life, but unbeknownst to me, Cambridge University Press contacted me and asked me would I write this volume for them. I don't mind saying this is the best university press in the world. If you publish with Cambridge, that's
saying something.
that's gourmet. They recognize the importance of African Methodism, even more so than I myself and others recognize how important this institution is. The other thing is that it gave me an opportunity to really tease out in a narrative, and it wasn't easy to describe the tension, the historical tension that exists within the church, whether in the 19th century or the 20th century or the 21st century, that tension between being on the front lines of African liberation and being engaged simultaneously and equally important in the task of institutional preservation, which itself is an act of Black self-determination. And the tensions that creates in terms of how ministers and members allocate their time and resources. And sometimes the church has handled that tension well, sometimes it's handled it less well, but that tension still remains. How much do you devote to institutional operations? Very important. The institution must survive in order to do the work of economic development, education, membership development, developing a Christian witness, and being involved in frontline Black liberation issues and movements. Those are important, and they're only 24 hours in a day. How do you allocate your time and resources and your finances to those respective tasks, each task being equally important? And trying to tease that out, trying to develop that within a narrative was at times a little tough, but I thought it was important to try to play out that scenario to see where one would arrive in the 21st century.
Okay. All right, so we're going to take a couple more questions, and it's a question about finances. The conversation about AME Church finances created a lot of discussion. Should the church focus more on investments to grow funds, fundraising, reducing costs, or eliminating projects?
Yes, 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 and yes. And here I'm quoting Bishop Philip R. Cousin, who I remember saying constantly that it's important for the church to develop multiple income streams. You can't just depend on plate offerings. The church is a large, complicated international institution with complicated operations and outreach and initiatives throughout the globe, and you just can't depend singularly on the vacillation of church offerings from Sunday to Sunday. We're in this COVID crisis. Look where that has left many of our local churches and our connectional church. And so we need different income streams. You do that through investments, through fundraising, through other kinds of development projects. Once finances are stabilized and predictable, then one can determine what structures are necessary in order to implement church objectives. That might mean eliminating some projects. It might mean substituting other projects. It might mean an expansion of projects. That can't be determined until your fiscal income is stabilized.
All right. Yes, thank you for that comment. We need to expand our business acumen.
Absolutely.
So my final question is, having examined the church as closely as you have and as deeply as you have, and now having this, a global perspective, a historical perspective, what would you say has been the greatest success of the denomination, and what is perhaps the greatest weakness?
The greatest success of the denomination has been its longevity and the vibrancy that it exhibited during its going on into its third century of existence. Keep in mind, the persons who kept this institution alive were people who were enslaved, some of whom were escapees from slavery. They were peasants who were sharecroppers and share tenants. They were common laborers. This is a church built by poor people with limited resources. They had expansive ambition. Imagine persons who were ex-slaves who envisaged their institution being the protector of other Black people in the Atlantic world. I mean, just imagine the kind of mindset in the mind of a slave, an ex-slave, a fugitive slave, to think that they could build an institution that could have that kind of global impact. My greatest weakness or disappointment is that the church has not been able, over the course of the centuries, not for a lack of trying, to match its ambitions with its resources. That's been a constant struggle. The church shouldn't be faulted for that because, as I said, keep in mind, AMEs historically are poor people. They're slaves, ex-slaves, sharecroppers, share tenants, common laborers in mills and mines. Those are the African Methodists. And that they were able to build an institution with this kind of resilience and longevity is remarkable. And that they lacked fully the resources that they needed to mobilize to match their ambitious agenda deserves not criticism, but applause.
Absolutely. I think that is the perfect way to end this series. Thank you so much for joining us on the panel and, of course, for this private discussion. And thank you, everyone in the audience, for your questions and comments. I would like to personally thank a few people, if I have this point of personal privilege. I would like to thank my husband, Reverend Stephen Anthony Cousin Jr., for all of his support, for lifting me up and telling me that I'm doing a good job and really making me feel supported throughout this entire series. This is a very new avenue for me, doing this, moderating, and he has been a constant source of support. So I want to thank my husband. I would also like to thank my sister-in-law, Dr. Diana Nicole Watkins Dickerson, and my brother-in-law, Mr. Thomas Kennard, for participating in this series, for participating as panelists. This has been really a family effort. I'd also like to thank my wonderful siblings, my oldest sister, Nicole, my other oldest sister, second oldest sister, Valerie, and my brother, Dennis Jr. They have been behind the scenes, so you have not seen them as much on camera, but they have been working very hard behind the scenes, and they have really been the ones to help keep this series going. And of course, I want to thank you, Dad, for writing this book and creating this great legacy for all of us AMEs and for my children to have this on their shelf. And so thank you so much for everything that you have done. And do you have any final words?
Yes, the person who stood behind not only this author, but all of the children, the grandchildren, and the sons-in-law and daughter-in-law was Mrs. Mary A.E. Dickerson.
Yes.
We have not seen on the screen, but whose strength, whose resilience, whose support, without which none of this would have happened.
Amen to that. And on that note, we will sign off. Thank you again, everyone who has joined us for this virtual companion series. Have a blessed day, have a blessed week, and go out and buy the book if you haven't done so already. Thank you so much.
Thank you.